Good afternoon. My name is Jasmine Allen, and I am the Director and Curator of the Stained Glass Museum. And it's my pleasure to be speaking to you today about an extraordinary collection of stained glass. The Stained Glass Museum is the only museum dedicated to stained glass in the UK. It is an independent accredited museum with a unique history, funded principally from paying visitors. Founded more than 50 years ago, the Stained Glass Museum first opened to the public in 1979 in Ely Cathedral. Our main gallery and activity still resides in Ely Cathedral today, in the South Triforium, an upper level of the cathedral nave above the south nave. Here you can see the development of stained glass from the 13th century to the present day. This spectacular setting is a reminder that stained glass is predominantly an architectural art form, and many of the stained glass windows in our collection, although certainly not all, were once part of the architectural fabric and decoration of buildings. A significant proportion of the museum's collection was amassed in the 1970s and 1980s, when many stained glass windows were rescued from closed and redundant churches across England, Scotland, and Wales, and saved for the nation. The museum has also rescued stained glass windows from other places of worship, including synagogues, and from various secular buildings, such as schools, hospitals, and private houses. In the last 20 years, the collection has grown significantly, with the addition of many modern and contemporary studio pieces, and we are still actively collecting today. As well as stained glass windows, the museum has a growing collection of designs, sketches, and working cartoons for stained glass tools, and glass materials. This afternoon, I will introduce you to a handful of stained glass works, which I hope will illustrate the broad chronological range and stylistic diversity of the collection, and demonstrate the enduring power and appeal of this art form, the power to convey narrative and meaning, inspire and stimulate us. Stained glass was a prominent art form in Europe during the medieval period, and its development was accelerated by the evolution of Gothic architecture and construction in stone. By the 12th century, churches and cathedrals were filled with colourful stained glass windows, which provided a practical function of letting in light and shutting out wind and rain, whilst also serving a narrative and symbolic function within the building. Within churches, stained glass windows were used to illustrate the tenets of the Christian faith, and often illuminated images of biblical figures and scenes. This early 13th century panel shows the head and shoulders of a bearded male figure in a frontal pose. It is a striking image with strong outlines and bold colouring. There are very few clues as to the identity of this figure, but the top of a yellow crown can be seen on his head. He has a halo and is wearing red robes. He must represent a king. The bust of a king would have originally formed part of a large window containing a complete figure. It once occupied a space high up in the eastern choir at Soissons Cathedral of Saint-Gervais-Saint-Protais in France. This explains the large-scale design of the figure, which is here, this panel around 70 by 90 centimetres. And it was designed to be legible at a great distance from the ground floor below. Begun in the late 12th century and brought into use by the early 13th, the choir at Soissons was a key building in the evolution of the high Gothic architectural style, and one of the very first cathedrals to include the giant figural stained glass windows, so characteristic of these great churches. Here you can see that spectacular part of Soissons Cathedral, the choir at the eastern end of the building. This view looks up at the clerestory, the uppermost part of the building, where there are a series of large window openings, 4 each on the north and south side, and 5 in the central apse. Much of what we see here today is the product of a 19th century restoration that pieced together 13th century fragments of glass from Soissons and elsewhere, and reset it alongside new pieces of 19th century painted glass. Today, the 13th century glass is predominantly seen in those 5 central axial windows, which are slightly brighter in colour. Our panel likely originated from one of the windows on the north or the south side, the paler windows. These are formed of 2 pairs of lancets surmounted by a tracery light. Today they're filled with modern glass, except for the tracery lights, which retained their 13th century panels. It is likely that each vertical opening or light would have contained 2 figures above one another. So how did this panel become separated from the rest of its figure? And why can we only see some of the original scheme at Soissons Cathedral today? Well, the answer is revealing of the ways in which stained glass windows are a part and parcel of a building, and vulnerable to changes and damage. Sometime in the late 18th century, it seems some of the glass was moved down from the clerestory level to the lower windows below. Then, in 1815, 2 nearby gunpowder factories exploded, damaging some of this glass. Several of the windows originally from the choir at Soissons were removed in the late 19th century and have since found their way into museum collections. There are panels that you can see at Glencairn Museum in Bryn Athyn, Philadelphia, and the museum in Kiev at Ukraine, not currently available. Here is a window depicting an Old Testament figure, the prophet Joel, which is today in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. And they have another prophet, Habakkuk, too. These more complete stained glass panels give us an impression of how this bust of a king might have appeared in Soissons Cathedral as a full figure. He may have originally had an inscription to identify him, and likely would have been seated on a throne, holding a scepter or a sword. The survival of these other panels also gives us a clue to the original iconographic scheme. At least some of the 13th century glazing of the choir at Soissons was paid for by King Philip II of France. It is likely that the scheme demonstrated the role of kingship and genealogy, placing New Testament apostles above Old Testament patriarchs, and perhaps patriarchs over kings of France, indicating the belief in the divine right of kings. Given its age, the panel has been restored on several occasions. Approximately half of the bust of the king panel today contains original glass in its original position, whilst a quarter of the panel is made up of medieval replacement pieces, and the final quarter, 19th century glass, to complete the picture. You can see that the panel has been repaired several times, with mending leads introduced to repair breaks, which appear today as interventions to the original design. And if you look across the eyes of this figure, I think that's the place you can most likely see these mending leads. Visitors to the museum are often surprised by how modern this 13th century panel appears to us today. The strong design and colour, dominated by vibrant reds and blues, is characteristic of French Gothic stained glass. But these are also characteristics that we tend to associate with modern 20th century art. A more muted palette can be seen in this medieval window, which dates from the 14th century. Biblical stories like the Annunciation, when Angel Gabriel appeared to the Virgin Mary and told her she was going to give birth to the Christ child, would have been immediately recognisable to a medieval audience. Devotion to the Virgin Mary was widespread across Europe in the Middle Ages, and particularly in England. This window is a fine example of 14th century glass painting, made around 1340 in England. Structurally, it shows an evolution of earlier medieval glazing, as it is a Gothic window with more than one glazed opening. In this case, 2 vertical window openings, spaces we call lights, which would have been divided by a stone mullion. Each light has a pointed top in keeping with the decorated Gothic style. And the evolution of Gothic architecture can be traced through the design of windows, which became increasingly elongated and more elaborate in form, with ever complicated shapes in their tracery. These narrow vertical window openings, which are more than 2 meters high and almost half a meter wide, were challenging spaces for the artist to fill. And one of the ways in which artists responded to this challenge was to design an individual figure of a saint, apostle, or king in each light, and fill the surrounding space with this micro-architecture. So here we see figures in a niche under an elaborate architectural canopy, resembling sculptures in niches. The S pose of the figure of the Virgin is very elegant and characteristic of this decorated international Gothic style. In this window, the gestures of the two figures are used to convey the narrative. Gabriel is shown in the act of giving a message. His pointed finger instructs, as well as informs the Virgin Mary of her duty as the woman chosen by God to bear his son. The figure of the Virgin Mary, shown on the right, conveys the surprise and shock of the young woman, who we remember was betrothed to Joseph, receiving this message. Yet as well as surprise, her open arms speak of an acceptance of God's will, and her facial expression and bodily pose maintain both her grace and composure. Indeed, for the literate, Gabriel carries a scroll with the Latin text, Ave Maria Gratia Plena, Hail Mary, full of grace. This text of biblical origin from the Gospel of Luke today forms the start of a traditional Christian prayer addressing Mary. And there are other symbols within the scene which together form part of the standard iconography of this scene, the Annunciation. The dove here represents the Holy Spirit, God incarnate, sent from heaven. And the dove appears to be flying directly into Mary's ear. This iconography, which suggests the Immaculate Conception taking place in the ear rather than in the womb, was influenced by a Marian reading of the Psalm 45 verse 10, Hear, O daughter, and consider, and incline your ear, forget your people and your father's house, and the king shall desire your beauty. At the bottom of Mary's feet, there is a flowering lily, a symbol of purity and virginity. And cleverly, this lily forms part of the architectural frame around the Virgin Mary, cementing her attributes and status. And finally, light is the ultimate symbol. The illuminated window itself would have been interpreted as the deity revealing itself to the human world, which is tremendously significant in Christian theology. This window is one of a series showing scenes from the early life of Christ, which once decorated the windows of the 14th century church dedicated to St. John the Baptist in Hadsor, Worcestershire. The church is still there, but now redundant. And the scheme of windows was heavily restored by stained glass and metalworking firm Hardman and Company of Birmingham in 1866, during the 19th century restoration of the church. The figure of the angel Gabriel on the left is a 19th century figure based on the original medieval design, but the figure of the Virgin is almost all complete. So you can see here that the red glass is the original medieval glass. And in extending this scheme of windows, the 19th century glass painters have been very faithful to the medieval originals. They've incorporated the surviving pieces of glass that they had, but notably, they made an effort to continue the use of gestures, noting their significance for the biblical narrative. So in the central pair of lights, which depicts the visitation of Mary to her cousin, Saint Elizabeth, then pregnant with John the Baptist, Elizabeth on the left both displays and gestures towards her womb, wherein lies John the Baptist, and Mary reaches her arms out towards her. And in the presentation of the Christ child in the temple on the right, Mary's hands are clasped in prayer, while Joseph gestures towards the high priest Simeon, carrying the infant Christ. Whilst many of us are not as familiar with Christian scripture as medieval viewers might have been, narrative stained glass like this was designed to be read, and close reading of these windows can be rewarding. It is also through close looking that we notice details that we may not have seen, decorative, characterful and humorous additions even, like these lion faces in the borders of the windows and the grotesque from the tracery light above. In the 19th century, stained glass began to be used more widely in secular contexts, and stained glass windows were commissioned to decorate town and country houses, civic and leisure buildings such as town halls, libraries, baths, and even public houses. One of the firms in the UK who are often credited with influencing the increased demand for stained glass in secular contexts was the firm of Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company, founded in 1861, and from 1875 known as Morris and Company, when Morris became the sole owner. From the outset, the company designed and made stained glass windows. Stained glass was one of the firm's most lucrative furnishings, and for which they're perhaps best known today. Well, this small panel depicting August threshing was once part of a complete set of 12 stained glass panels depicting the labours of the month by Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company. The labours of the month were a popular theme in the medieval period, and they demonstrated a human response to God's ordering of the universe, as well as the importance of the agricultural cycle in society. In the 19th century, the revival of such imagery demonstrated an interest in medieval art, but also reflected a romantic vision of rural life, which had drastically changed since the Industrial Revolution. August is one of 2 Labour of the Month panels in the museum's collection that once formed part of the glazing scheme of the drawing room of Silsden House, Keighley in Yorkshire. Silsden House, designed by the architect Richard Norman Shaw, was the home of Charles Hastings, a Bradford worsted spinning manufacturer. Although the stained glass was removed before Silsden House was demolished in 1903, the rest of the stained glass panels that would have completed the calendar year are untraced today. So this panel, August, designed in 1863 by Pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti, shows a male figure wearing a red shirt and green overtunic, brown trousers and a hat. He is shown threshing grain using a flail. Although threshing machines were developed from the 17th century onwards, this labourer threshes by hand with a grain flail, no longer in use today. This tool is composed of a swipple, a long piece of wood used to strike the grain, and a handle connected by a leather chain. The rectangular panel provides a very close frame for the figure. A border of thin white surrounded by thicker green glass crops his right foot on the bottom right there, and also the top of his wooden flail. In the top right-hand corner of the panel is a small image of the Virgin Mary reading, likely representing the zodiac symbol for Virgo. Virgo is the 6th sign of the zodiac and translates from the Latin as virgin. Here is the second panel that we have from this series, December, Killing a Hog, also designed by Rossetti. And in this scene, a male figure wearing a blue tunic over a shirt and a hat and a cape over his shoulders is shown kneeling on the ground, scouring the bristles from a dead hog. He sits with the hog between his knees, with its head placed over a bucket to catch the blood. His left hand grips onto the bristles tightly, whilst his right scours the bristles with a small, sharp knife. In the background is a holly bush behind a fence. The holly reminds us that it is December, and the killing of a hog at this time of year was important because food for the animals became more scarce, and also the cold temperatures of the winter months made it easier to keep meat for longer. A small panel of clear glass in the top right-hand corner of the frame would have likely originally contained a goat, representing the 10th sign of the zodiac, Capricorn. Now, Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company often used the same designs across different artistic media and worked collaboratively with different designers in the firm contributing individual elements or drawing for a single scheme. And we can see this in a set of designs for the labours of the month produced by the Morris firm, not in stained glass, but as tiles. These are in the collection of the William Morris Gallery in Walthamstow. And you can see here on the bottom row, our months of August and December by Rossetti, amongst others. Now, these tiles were hand painted by Lucy Orensmith, née Faulkner. She was friends with Morris and sister of Charles Faulkner, one of the co-founding partners of the firm. Another complete set of labours of the month produced by the Morris firm can be seen in situ at Queen's College at the University of Cambridge. This series was commissioned by George Frederick Bodley in 1862 for the overmantel of the fireplace in the Old Hall, completed in 1864 and modified in 1873 by the addition of tiles depicting the two foundress queens, top left and right. There are several differences between the tiles in the William Morris Gallery and at Queen's College. Some figures and symbols differ. The Queen's tiles do not include the zodiac symbols designed by Webb and are a little larger, being 6 inches high rather than the 5-inch tiles used for the others. The tiles in the collection of the William Morris Gallery, the one shown here on the right, are a closer match in both design, colouring and size to the stained glass panels at the Stained Glass Museum. Both are around 5 inches or 13 centimetres. And it's interesting to compare them all three close up because we see here the adaptation of a design for different media. And perhaps better seen in looking at the month of December, where in the stained glass panel, December has a simplified background. Now, this holly could have easily been painted onto a tile. So I would suggest here that the winter branch in the design in the tile was actually the original design for this month, as this would have been much harder to achieve in glass and lead due to the intricacies of the winter branches. Windows in the Gothic tradition continued to be the mainstay in British stained glass up until the Second World War. However, in early 20th century Britain, some of the more innovative stained glass artists were beginning to explore modern expressions in stained glass. This panel of the Virgin and Child is the work of Margaret Traherne. It measures about 1.3 metres high, 0.7 metres wide. And the Stained Glass Museum has a fantastic collection of work by women artists from the 19th century onwards. Margaret Traherne studied at Croydon School of Art from 1936 and during the Second World War at Kingston School of Art. She later studied at both the Royal College of Art and Central School of Arts and Crafts, where she encountered stained glass, taught by the likes of Martin Travers, Lawrence Lee and John Baker. As well as stained glass, she worked in sculpture, embroidered textiles and mixed media. Her interest in colour and her approach to stained glass generally were influenced by the work of French expressionist painters like Georges Rouault. The panel of the Virgin and Christ Child is figurative, but already shows moves towards a loose abstraction, with strong, angular and expressive painted lines. The Virgin Mary is a seated figure in blue, and upon her lap is a standing Christ Child. A close look at the pose reveals it is likely to have been studied from life, like so many artworks focusing on mother and child. The way that the infant balances on her lap, leaning slightly to the viewer's left, his right arm supported by his mother, whose open arms form a crescent shape across the composition, appears entirely natural. He is also reaching to his left, our right, where the Virgin Mary appears to be holding an object. Is this a rattle, an orb, a crown? It is not clear. The figures are both predominantly in shades of blue, a royal blue for the Virgin and a paler blue for the Christ child. The colour palette is very cool, slightly warmed by the yellow, created by silver stain, which surrounds the two figures and acts as a sort of halo around them, turning to lilac shades of purple at the edges. The sombre, rather cool tones of this piece do not appeal to everybody at first glance, but it is a very beautiful piece, full of feeling and skillfully executed. Unlike a painter who applies colour to their canvas, stained glass artists must work with the colour of their glass. And here, Traherne is working with several layers of colour in what we call flashed glass. This is glass with more than one layer of colour, often on top of a base layer of clear glass. Using acid, Traherne has etched away layers of the coloured glass to give a gradient of colour intensity from dark to light hues, and in some places, remove the colour from the flashed glass entirely. And if you look at the face of the Virgin Mary here, you will see that very dark blue, which is part of the same piece of glass, has been abraded away to reveal that white layer underneath for the main part of her face. And this detail also shows the paint lines, which at times accentuate the leading, following its contours, and at other times seem to work against or across it. At the time this panel was made in 1956, such abstraction was fairly rare in British stained glass, especially in churches. However, Traherne was part of a younger generation of artists who took a bolder and more modern approach to this art form and created freer expressions. This was one of her earliest stained glass works, made for Michelham Priory in Sussex. Much of her later works are more abstract and completely devoid of figures. Abstract stained glass is somewhat of a specialism for artist Brian Clark. Today, he is one of the leading exponents of architectural stained glass in Britain. And this image is a detail from his large Peel cottage window made in 1982. Talented at a young age, Clark was actually awarded a scholarship to Oldham School of Arts and Crafts aged 12, which meant he skipped a normal school education and was entirely trained in arts and designs. Aged 15, he lied about his age to get into Burnley College of Art, and in 1970 studied architectural stained glass in North Devon. But aged 21 in 1974, Clark won a travelling scholarship to study medieval and contemporary stained glass in Italy, France, and West Germany, as it was then. He was deeply inspired by the German post-war stained glass artists, especially the work of Johannes Schreiter. Clark's practice in architectural and autonomous stained glass, often on a monumental scale, has led to successive innovation and invention in the development of the medium. In the late 1970s, he was part of London's punk scene and collaborated with the likes of David Bailey, Malcolm McLaren, Linda and Paul McCartney. The 1982 Peel cottage window, seen here in its entirety, was the first of several works Clark designed for the same space in his home studio. It's a very large piece, almost 2 meters high and about 1.5 meters wide. The abstract composition, in 2 panels, is made up of a regular matrix of squares of mouth-blown glass in varying shades of transparent green and opaque white, overlaid with these constructivist shapes or reticules in blue and white, and amorphic forms with floating calligraphic lead lines laid over the stable structure, which is punctuated by a single red cross. Now, you might see a grid when you look at this, and some of you may also remember the game Tetris, invented in 1984 in the USSR, which was popular in Europe from 1988, when it was acquired by Nintendo for its Game Boy console. But Brian Clark's 1982 work predates that game. In Brian's own words, he was really preoccupied with the grid and ways of undermining it. Grids have always been a source of pleasure for me, probably because they deliver a reliable basis for art to challenge the idea of the constant. If you begin with order, disruption, or even chaos, will inevitably follow. At the time, I was appropriating the musical ideas of repetitive structural rhythms being punctuated by sounds that leap free from a matrix. I listened to this kind of music while I was working. Eno, Kraftwerk, Ligeti. Norman Foster and I had many stimulating conversations on the implications of this idea to architecture. Those are the words of Brian Clark in 2019. Clark has explored the possibilities of coloured glass and architecture on a vast scale for a variety of contexts, including shopping centres, offices, airports, and mosques, as well as churches and private homes. If you go to the Victoria Quarter Shopping Centre in Leeds, look up and you will see a stained glass ceiling which provides a glazed roof extending across the entire pedestrianised area, which was once a street, connecting the two restored Victorian arcades. The finished work is over 400 feet long, and at the time of its completion in 1990, was the largest secular work of stained glass in the world. Such large-scale architectural glass artworks demonstrate the exciting possibilities of stained glass in injecting colour and enlivening contemporary architecture. And stained glass remains a relevant and exciting art form today. This is one of the Stained Glass Museum's most recent acquisitions, a portrait by American artist Kehinde Wiley. Titled St. Adelaide, it is a portrait of a young black man in contemporary clothing and trainers, holding an orb and scepter with a halo. It is a larger-than-life portrait, more than 2.5 meters high and over 1 meter wide, which stops visitors in their tracks. Wiley has harnessed the unique quality and historic associations of stained glass as a monumental art form used in Western Europe to address cultural questions and concerns today. He references historical artworks in his own artworks which address contemporary issues. And this composition for St. Adelaide is directly copied from a 19th century stained glass window depicting the Christian St. Adelaide, designed by French academic painter Ingres for the Chapel of Saint Ferdinand in Paris, which was made by the Royal Manufactory at Sèvres in 1843. By replacing this traditional religious female saint with a portrait of an ordinary black man, Mark Shavers, whose name we can see inscribed on the plinth, Wiley plays with ideas and representations of religion and power, gender and race. Like Brian Clark, Kehinde Wiley was a young artistic prodigy who gained a scholarship to study at the Art Conservatory in Russia aged 11 in the 1980s. He gained his Bachelor of Fine Arts from the San Francisco Art Institute in 1999 and received a scholarship to complete his Masters in Fine Art at Yale in 2001. Since the early 2000s, he has made waves on the art scene with his paintings, and recently ventured into sculptures and stained glass too. His work has added much to the portraiture genre at large, working in historic conventions, but also diversifying the genre and drawing attention to the lack of representation of Black people in Western art. And he has extended this to stained glass here. By placing ordinary people into stained glass works, a monumental art form often used in sacred spaces, and through using the same visual devices and symbols, Wiley brings into question the figures we hold up for veneration. He also questions societal stereotyping and the representation of Black people, especially young Black men, in the media. When it was acquired by the Stained Glass Museum in 2020, St. Adelaide was the first of Wiley's stained glass artworks to be placed on permanent display in a public collection in the world. It was designed and made in 2014 as part of a series of works on these themes for Wiley's first major retrospective exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum in New York. Today, in the Stained Glass Museum, where it stands proudly, it is a reminder of the power of stained glass to inspire and challenge us. we see a detail here. So that was a whistle-top tour of just a handful of pieces from our collection, and I hope you enjoyed looking at those with me. Thank you to Art UK for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you to all of you for attending. It's been a pleasure